Hello and welcome to Latika Takes, a podcast with me, Latika Berg. Hi, welcome back to the podcast. This week I'm in Yerevan, Armenia, at the Yerevan Dialogue. I have learned so much about this region and in particular this country in just the wild 48 hours I've been here during what has been quite the week for this tiny former Soviet country. Armenia this week hosted the European political community, which saw not just EU leaders here, but also the UK's Keir Starmer, Canada's Mark Carney and Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky. And that one's really interesting because of Armenia's changing relationship with Russia. The next day, Armenia held the EU-Armenia summit and then the dialogue, which has just wrapped up. The headline speaker there was the French President Emmanuel Macron, who stayed an entire 3 nights here in Yerevan and charmed the socks off everyone. In fact, I had one Turkish ex-diplomat say to me, maybe a little bit enviously, I've never recalled Macron spending 3 nights in Istanbul. So I figure this is quite a moment to dissect what all of this means and what all of this says about where Armenia's been, where it's going, and its potential European future. To do all that, I'm joined by Armenia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Robert Abisoghomonyan. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Tell me, how does Armenia see itself, Eurasian or European?
It's a very difficult question, actually. I should approach this question based on the values that Armenia is pursuing, is making it European. Because we are in favor of further strengthening the democratic values, the human rights, the rule of law, and this is the values that connect us with Europe and the European Union. And our society is also in favor of the European path of the Republic of Armenia. Why I say so is you may heard that last year the Parliament of the Republic of Armenia adopted a law asking the government to start the European integration process. And this was driven by the society. It was not a governmental initiative, it was not a parliamentary initiative, it was an initiative put forward by the society, because in our legislation we have a point that the society can get a certain amount of signatures and ask the parliament to adopt a law based on this request. If the parliament rejects this, they can go on further, collect more signatures, and ask for referendum on the very topic. So in this case, the society gathered 50,000 signatures and asked the parliament to adopt a law on starting the European integration of the Republic of Armenia, and the parliament positively responded and it was adopted. So,
is that a first for Armenia? Give me some context. Does this happen often, where the society asks the parliament to do big things like this?
It was the first one that was adopted, actually, that had major support within the society. Of course, there were certain attempts to gather some signatures around other topics, but this was the first time that reached the parliament and it was adopted in the parliament.
Was there a turning point or a turning incident that fueled this societal drive?
The turning point actually was back 5 years ago, I should say, even after the 2020 war in our region, when we as Armenians living in Armenia and the government, we understood that we should start balancing foreign policy. We should not rely on one power, and we should start to cooperate with other partners more intensively and strengthen this partnership. And in these circumstances, we started to cooperate and strengthen our relations with the EU. And during several years, during the last 2 years, I should say that this partnership become more enhanced. Previously, we had the cooperation framework, SEPA, so for implementation of certain reforms in the Republic of Armenia. But now we level up to this cooperation, and at the end of last year, we have signed a strategic partnership with the European Union, which envisage many areas for cooperation, Of course, one of the priorities that I can mention now is the visa liberalization dialogue that we have received the roadmap for its implementation, and we are actively implementing this roadmap, because not only for foreign policy, each policy requires the approval of the society. And this is one of the elements that the society approves and society sees like in its daily life, the changes that take place in Armenia.
What happened in 2020 that made Armenians decide they couldn't or shouldn't rely on a sole power? And the power we're talking about is Russia, right?
Actually, the 2020 was the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, but it was not 2020 that was a turning point when we decided that we should not rely on Russia, actually. It was 2022 when there was an attack on the sovereign territory of the Republic of Armenia.
By Azerbaijan.
By Azerbaijan. And it was then that Armenia applied to the military alliance that it was part to it. Still we are part, but we have frozen our participation to it. We have applied to them asking for, because it is a military alliance, and when there is an attack on the sovereign territory on one of the parties of this alliance, it is regulated by its charter.
Okay, so Armenia has a NATO-style alliance with Russia.
Yes.
Meaning that if you get attacked, you would expect Russia to come and help you.
It's not only Russia. With Russia, we have bilateral also agreements, but it encompasses 5 states, actually. It's Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Belarus, and Tajikistan.
Okay, and did any of those countries come and help you?
No one can help us. And the response was a kind of, you don't have a delimited border with Azerbaijan, and we don't know where the sovereign territory of the Republic of Armenia is.
Wow. So how did that go down in Armenia?
Of course, it was accepted by a huge frustration. Previously, there was also already a frustration in the society of Armenia connected with Russia.
And we should remind listeners who aren't aware of Armenia, you're post-Soviet. You were a Soviet country.
Yes. And the second turning point was actually the events in 2023, because after 2020, Russia, we signed a kind of ceasefire agreement by the mediation. It was not an agreement, it was a joint statement, actually.
This is with Azerbaijan to
it's
stop the
with
fighting.
Azerbaijan by the mediation of Russia, actually. And Russia deployed its peacekeeping forces in Karabakh in order to ensure the peace. But after 2023, when the second wave of attack took place and which resulted the displacement of the whole population of Karabakh, and the Russian peacekeepers didn't take any actions in this regard. So this was the second wave of frustration in Armenian society.
What has that taught Armenians about Russia's word and what Russia's word means?
Actually, it was not largely discussed about the Russian words. It was just the frustration and the understanding that we should not rely on Russia when it comes to security issues. And there are a lot of partners with which we can cooperate on this agenda. Of course, we continue to have economic relations with Russia. As you mentioned, we are a former Soviet republic, and of course, we have economic ties with Russia. But of course, we should not continue the path that makes us rely on one partner.
Did the war in Ukraine, the full-scale invasion, did that affect Armenians' thinking at all? I think you're fairly neutral on the war in Ukraine. Can you explain to me how that developed in the wider frame of your recalibration of how you view your security in Armenia?
When it comes to war in Ukraine and each and every conflict, taking into account our own experience, we think that all the issues should be discussed around the table on a diplomatic way. This is the way for bringing stability. And we know it from our own experience. We had the war in early 90s, we had the war in 2020. So unless you sit around the table and discuss the issues with the other parties, at least the example of Armenia shows that there is no any stability and peace to be achieved.
What would you see as a preferred outcome in Armenia's interests for how Russia and Ukraine end or come to a ceasefire?
I should say that any outcome that is acceptable for Ukraine, that is acceptable for the other parties, will be acceptable also for Armenia.
Now, Armenia has been in the headlines because you're one of the many wars that Donald Trump says he solved. Is that how it's viewed here in Yerevan, that Donald Trump rode in on a dashing unicorn, shall we say, and ended your war? Is that what really happened?
Donald Trump has played a crucial role in the issue. At the same time, the Prime Minister was talking about this during the opening session of today's dialogue. So it started in 2022 when there was a quadrilateral meeting during the first EPC, actually, in Prague, organized by President Macron, the former President Charles Michel, and the Prime Minister of Armenia and the President of Azerbaijan. And it was the beginning of the modalities on which the peace will be based. It was in Prague that the parties agreed that we should recognize each other's territorial integrity based on the Almaty Agreement. And the Almaty Agreement was signed after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where the former Soviet countries decided or agreed that their administrative borders will become international borders between them. So based on this agreement, we will build the peace process. So it was due to the mediation, due to the efforts of President Macron and also the President Charles Michel, actually. After 2022, we have started the negotiations with the Azerbaijani side on a peace agreement. In 2025 March, we succeeded to finalize the peace agreement, the text of the peace agreement.
By which time Donald Trump has returned to the White House.
Yes, exactly. And we have publicly announced about this, that the sides have completed and finalized the negotiations on peace agreement, and the Armenian side even declared its readiness to sign the peace agreement as soon as possible. Of course, the peace is not only the peace agreement, it's a complex issue, because the discussions with the Azerbaijani side were going on not only, and continues actually, not only on the peace agreement, but also on the delimitation of the borders between Armenia and Azerbaijan, as well as the opening of communications in the region. The two issues, the signing of the peace agreement and the communication issues, get its place in the trilateral statement in Washington in August 8, 2025, and it is due to the efforts of the administration and personal efforts of President Trump, actually. In Washington, we managed to initial the peace agreement, and also in trilateral declaration, there was an agreement to, of course, to establish a TRIP project, Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity, and this will be the main connectivity project for opening or unblocking the regional communications for interstate, international transportation. And what is very important to mention here is that in Washington, we agreed that the connectivity and the communication will take place on the basis of respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and under the national jurisdiction of the countries.
So does the seal of Washington, President Trump, that matters to the durability of the peace you've signed?
The agreement on TRIP, actually, is one of the crucial points that can ensure the durability of the peace. Why? Because personally, I believe that peace can be achieved when the interests of the parties coincide. And TRIP is the project where the interests of Armenia and Azerbaijan coincide.
How does Russia treat Armenia now that it sees you embracing the European Union, seeking membership? This week I thought was extraordinary. You hosted the European political community. You hosted not just Mark Carney of Canada, but also Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. This seems to me a huge moment. What was Armenia as a government trying to say by hosting this conference and the EU-Armenia summit again today?
Look, we are not trying to cooperate with some partners on the expense of the other partners, actually. This is the format, European political community, where the European leaders gather to discuss the current issues, to discuss the issues that are within their interests. And within this format, actually, the leaders of various countries participate. So it's natural that the president of Ukraine should participate in this format. Of course, for the first time, there was an invitation to Canadian Prime Minister, and I believe his participation brought an added value also to the discussions. His interventions also during yesterday's events was very valuable.
I've got to say, though, if I was Vladimir Putin watching all of this, feeling Armenia perhaps slip out of my grip of influence, we know that Russia doesn't like this. Have you felt an anger or any sort of revenge or action or interference in your politics from Russia as a result?
As I have said, we are not trying to cooperate with the partners at the expense of the others. So we try to keep the relations with Russia. The economic relations are very good, so we try to keep this track of relations and cooperate also with Russia without harming the relations with the others or harming the relations with other partners at the expense of Russia.
I mean, if you pull that off, that's an incredible testament to your diplomacy. So tell me about the EU. Do you really think EU membership is feasible, or is it a pipe dream?
So when we started, even before, there was some kind of enhancement of the cooperation. But a turning point, I should say, is one of the interventions of my Prime Minister in the European Parliament. And during his statement, he declared that Armenia is ready to deepen its relations with the European Union as much as the European Union deems it appropriate or deems it possible. So we move forward with this understanding.
So I live in London. 10 years ago, my second country voted to leave the European Union. And I think when that happened, everyone thought Brexit might trigger all these other Brexits or Frexits or Grexits. But actually, the reverse has happened. We see Iceland fast-tracking a referendum to join the EU. We see Moldova, Ukraine banging at the door, the Balkans the same. You would obviously clearly like to join, your voters would like to join. What do you make of Britain exiting the club that everyone suddenly wants to join?
So we are trying to enhance this cooperation to the point that we will be eligible for the European integration.
Do you have a date? By when?
No, we haven't set any date for the European integration. As soon as the European Union will declare that we are ready for the European integration, we can start the discussions, actually.
One of the things I've noticed, maybe it's just because it's EPC week, but I saw all these European Union flags flying around Yerevan. And I see that a lot in Ukraine too. And it's an expression of this desire to join a movement that operates for those things, like you said before, democracy, human rights, rule of law. In Ukraine, that led to a very bitter reaction from Russia. Do you not worry about the same?
I should say since 2018, when a non-violent velvet revolution took place in the Republic of Armenia, the democratic path in Armenia started then is now irreversible. The snap parliamentary elections in 2021, which took place under an immense pressure and which took place under very tough conditions after a war, and there was a huge debate in our society, showed that this process is irreversible. So the society has chosen a democratic path, and our task is only to strengthen these democratic values and only to enhance it.
It's one of the reasons I love coming to this part of the world. I honestly find it very inspiring to see all these countries struggling for what people like me who grew up in countries like Australia get to live in the UK. We just take it for granted. We have it given to us from birth. It's an incredible privilege to see other people fighting for this.
But I believe the whole world nowadays is fighting for this, because all the values, the order established actually previously is now shaking. And the world is fighting for keeping their values. Of course, it's a little bit difficult for new democracies, but still, if you believe in these values and you have the will to strengthen, to continue this path, I'll say we should work together with like-minded partners, of course, in order to enhance and in order to reach the end goal.
Who do you work with? One of the instructive trips I recently did was to Moldova, listening to parliamentarians there talking about how they actively, daily, sometimes hourly, were fighting off Russian disinformation campaigns before their elections. They were prepared for big voting movements when Russians tried to infiltrate voting. I'm wondering, you have elections coming up in Armenia. Are you learning any of these best practices and applying them here?
Of course, when it comes to elections, we see the hybrid threats, the disinformation, misinformation, and we are trying to see how the other partners, other countries have been fighting against this phenomenon, trying to cooperate with some partners in order to be able to fight, to combat this phenomena. But at the end of the day, there is a political will of the government of Armenia to conduct free, fair, and transparent elections.
One of the other relationships Armenia has is with Iran. Can you tell me a bit about Armenia's history with the Iranians, how you came to have such close relations, and then we'll get to the future of where you see the regime now following the war?
With Iran, as you have mentioned, we had always had friendly relations. And it's natural because due to the conflict in the region, we had closed borders with Azerbaijan and Turkey. So Iran and Georgia were our only path to the outer world. And in terms of economic resilience, in terms of logistics, Iran has a very important role for the Republic of Armenia. As I mentioned at the beginning, taking also into account our experience, we always advocate for resolving all the issues in a diplomatic way. Of course, the situation in Iran has negative impact on Armenia, on the economy of Armenia, and further deepening the conflict will have further negative impacts on Armenia also in terms of humanitarian situation.
We've heard varying reasons for the war from the Trump administration. On the first day, it was regime change. Do you think, or do you get a read, given your relationship with Iran, that regime change is possible in Iran?
We hope that all issues can be discussed between the interested partners. We know by the mediation of Pakistan, there are negotiations on resolving the issues between the parties, and the Iranian government and the US government are discussing all the challenges, all the issues, and we hope that these discussions will bring some results.
So when Israel wiped out all those leaders on the first day, do you pick up your phone and say, who do I call in Iran? Because that seems to be the vibe in Washington. Trump keeps saying, there's no leader. We don't know who to call. We don't know who to talk to. They're all contradicting each other. It's why we can't get an agreement. Is that what you see as a complication?
During this situation, my foreign minister had several conversations with all the partners in Gulf countries, also in Iran with the foreign minister of Iran. And our message was pretty much clear that we support and we advocate for the peace and stability in the region.
The second reason, and this now seems to be a big point of topic about holding up a potential end, is a nuclear weapon. What is your sense of how far along Iran is in developing a nuclear weapon? And is it something that Armenia believes the greater West should try and stop? Is the Trump administration right to try and stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear bomb?
You know, just now, currently, on these very days, a conference on nuclear non-proliferation, NPT treaty, is going on in New York. And Armenia is a staunch supporter of the NPT treaty. At the same time, the Republic of Armenia itself develops peaceful nuclear energy. We have a nuclear power plant, and we are actively cooperating with the IAEA. And I believe there are tools in international organizations, in the face of IAEA, in the face of nuclear non-proliferation treaty, that can be helpful in this situation.
So by that, do I take that to mean you think the IAEA can monitor effectively whether Iran is getting to enrichment phase?
I know that there was some cooperation between Iran and IAEA. Actually, my reference point is the declaration of statements made by the Director General of the IAEA. So I believe this can be a helpful platform in order to discuss the issues.
And on the broader objective, do you think Iran should have a weapon? Is it something that Trump is right to stop?
As I have said, Armenia is a staunch supporter of NPT.
Okay. I think that brings us to my final question. What effect do you think multilateralism has in this world where, as you said, democracy is shaking, all this order that we've known is really under threat?
The whole of my career, or the most part of my career, I have served in multilateral affairs. And I am a staunch believer of the multilateralism. But at the same time, I should admit that the multilateral organizations and multilateral platforms that were once created to address the challenges, the needs, the interests of its member states are not serving to its purpose. To some extent, the multilateral organizations or multilateral platforms has become a place where member states are gathering and making some statements, positioning on various issues, but there is no any concrete action. Despite the fact that during all these years, a huge amount of tools has been created for addressing various issues.
What's the most egregious examples?
The conflicts in the world. Let's look through all the challenges in the world where we see the international organizations. So they must be more active. There must be actively implementing their tools, early warning tools, conflict prevention tools, like the tools that will prevent human rights violations of international. And there are these tools. The resolutions, GA resolutions, Security Council resolutions, the decisions on the various regional organizations. So it gives us this ample toolbox for addressing these threats.
Is it a case of the tools not being used, or a case that the tools themselves are perhaps a fiction?
It's both. It's both, I should say, because these tools should be adapted to new realities. The world is developing and changing very rapidly, and we should be fast enough in order to adapt this toolbox to the new realities. But on the other hand, there should be a working method in order to apply these tools. There should be a consensus among also the member states that these tools should be applied in order to address the challenges that the world is facing in its various parts.
But maybe we could put MPT there, because Iran, Iran, if we are to believe, is on its way to creating a nuclear weapon. All these countries, like Australia, Armenia, they go to the UN and say, we don't believe in nuclear proliferation. And yet Trump comes in and says, nor do I, and I'm going to do something about it. Isn't that actually the real reality?
But that is why the review conferences are organized. Currently, a review conference is taking place in New York. So if there are some concerns regarding the treaty to be outdated, regarding some provisions of the treaty that should be adapted to new realities, I believe this is the right place to discuss this.
And do you believe there are on nuclear, or are you talking broadly?
I'm talking broadly.
Okay, got you.
I'm talking about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, actually.
Mm-hmm. So another area where I think Armenia is quite passionate is climate change. You're hosting a COP on biodiversity later this year. Can you really achieve much on COP when Trump's mantra is drill, baby, drill? I'm actually going to punish countries that don't want to drill, baby, drill. And China is doing what it's doing.
This year we are going to host the COP on biodiversity, and we believe that it is very important. Of course, various countries have their sovereign right in order to participate or not to participate, or to contribute or not on the discussions, on the achievements. But As a presidency, we believe that these discussions are very important. The thing that makes the biodiversity COP important for this year is the global review of our commitments, which is very important because several years ago we set some goals and targets to be achieved till 2030 and beyond. Some of them are the targets 2050. And it's very important to take stock where we are, to see the gaps and the means for their implementation. And this is the point which makes the COP in Yerevan, I don't want to say exclusive, but a kind of milestone meeting for biodiversity issues.
Hasn't Trump and his war in Iran made all our efforts to transition a lot harder in the short term?
So I can say here about the Republic of Armenia. Here we are developing the solar energy. Because as today in the morning, Prime Minister said, we can become a supplier of energy. We have a huge amount of energy nowadays. And this is solar, actually. As I've said, we have a nuclear power plant, which is also green energy. And I believe the development of the green energy is very important. And for Armenia, we have this policy in order to continue the development of this field.
Let's finish where we began. We hear a lot from the Trump administration about the strength or weakness of Europe. According to the Make America Great Again movement, Europe is weak, it's let in too many immigrants, it can't defend itself, and it's now effectively got to be taught a severe lesson. Why would you want to join that Europe? And is that the Europe you see?
As I've said, Armenia is in favor of having a balanced and balancing foreign policy. We have a strategic partnership also with the United States. We signed a strategic partnership in the beginning of 2025, and we are developing very enhanced relations with the US side in various fields, actually.
And is the ultimate goal to have a Western alliance as opposed to a Russian alliance?
No, the ultimate goal is to have the balanced and balancing foreign policy and to cooperate with all the partners in the fields that will bring benefits, will meet the interests of Armenia and its society.
Thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Latika Takes with me, Latika Berg. You can find my work at latikambirk.com and this podcast where you find all your podcasts. See you next time.